We're resuming with Exodus chapter 12, going over the description of the institution of the first Passover. And we left off, I believe, at verse 8, where the Israelites are given the direction, they shall eat the flesh that night, roasted with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, they shall eat it. So this sacrifice of the Passover lamb, right? Remember, authentic sacrifice does not change God, it changes us. And so part of the purpose of this sacrifice is, a lamb would be, you'd be taking out a financial hit, okay, by sacrificing a lamb, so you do feel that pinch and that pushing you towards that reliance on God. But this feast is also going to be catechetical and symbolic and also foreshadowing ultimately of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. And it's going to be a remembrance for the Israelites of what God did for them. And also the purpose of eating the lamb is to give them energy and sustenance for the long journey that they're about to embark. Okay, which is another foreshadowing of the Eucharist, which is the food for our journey on earth, journey towards heaven. The Israelites need to eat the lamb so they have the energy to go from land of sin, cross to the Red Sea, get baptized right in the wilderness, and then make it to the promised land at the end. All right, let's jump down to verse 11. In this manner you shall eat it, your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So all that imagery is you're basically, think of the modern day equivalent, you're dressed and ready to go on your road trip, the van is packed up, and you're eating this quick meal and everything with like your car keys in hand, okay? And your shoes are on for the journey. Yes.
What chapter are you in?
We're on chapter 12. Verse 12. So now chapter 12, verse 12. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. All right, so God's executing his judgment. The gods of Egypt, they're weak, or they're fake. And the firstborn, remember we talked about this with Onan, the firstborn son is your primary economic security for your family. Because the father of the household, he's going to make it to 50 if he's lucky. So if the firstborn son is killed off, that means by the time the father is like hitting his range of going to die, his next born son may not be old enough, right? Or he'll still be kind of young in terms of taking over the reins of the family, protecting the mom, getting married, beginning his own family. So this is going to cripple Egyptian society. On top of just like the pain of losing your own, like a child, right? It's also going to it's going to be very bad, harmful for them socially. Verse 13, the blood shall be a sign for you upon the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. That's the name of Passover. And no plague shall fall upon you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall observe it as an ordinance forever. 7 days, because they're entering into a new covenant with God now, right? So the covenantal number comes into play. For 7 days, you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day, you shall put away leaven out of your house. For if anyone eats what is leavened, from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Why do they have to eat unleavened bread? Does anyone here ever bake bread? Is that a hand?
What?
Okay. They have to eat the meal with their loin skirt, sandals on, staff in hand. What's the connection of unleavened bread to that whole thing? For you bakers out there.
It's quick.
It's quick. Okay, so Astron, wait for me to call you next time for justice sake. Okay, so it's quick. All right, leavening the bread takes time. You have to wait for the dough to rise, all right, and then you bake it. When you have to go, and you have to move fastly and quickly, You don't have time to wait for the bread to leaven, so you just throw it in quickly and then you bake it. And that's why Israel has to eat this unleavened bread. It's to remind them of how quickly and with what haste they left Egypt. Verse 16, on the first day, you shall hold a holy assembly, and on the seventh day, a holy assembly. No work shall be done in those days, but what everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. All right, so this is the first Sabbath law. It's not necessarily going to have to take place on a Saturday in this context here, because it is it's always going to be the first of the month, right? Then you begin counting forward. But again, the whole point of this sacrifice, this feast, it's supposed to be reminding the Israelites of what God's done to them so that they maintain a faithful life. Verse 17, and you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an ordinance forever. All right, so this feast has a catechetical purpose. Better have that like annotated in there that this is a catechetical purpose. All right, the ancient Israelites, they don't have printing presses. They don't have Baltimore catechisms. They don't have like mass productions of commentaries. But what they do have for their catechesis, the way that the religion is passed on, it's passed on through the feasts and the celebrations and the lessons that are supposed to be taught with them. Let's jump down to verse 21. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, select lambs for yourselves according to your families and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood which is in the basin and touch it to the lintel and the two doorposts with the blood which is in the basin. If you want to make a note, the hyssop that's referenced, take a bunch of hyssop. In John's Gospel, chapter 19, Christ is offered a sponge of vinegar on a hyssop branch. All right, and that's just the further connection between John's Gospel and the Exodus, tying Christ as the new Passover lamb.
It was 19.
What's that? Chapter 19. John chapter 19. Verse 23. For the Lord will pass through to slay the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to slay you. You shall observe this rite as an ordinance for you and for your sons forever. Highlight that, okay? Why does God want the Israelites to do this? It's so that they observe it forever. They teach it to their kids. Verse 26. And when your children say to you, why do we do this every year? Why does Santa Claus bring us presents? Why does the Easter Bunny leave us baskets? Okay, those are like the most superficial aspects of those holidays. Why is there a special midnight mass that we attend at Christmas, right? What's the answer that you would teach your children? It's like, well, because Christ was born in the dead of night, and we're celebrating Christ's birth. Okay, there's a catechesis that comes with the celebration, all right, with the ceremony. And so God commands the Israelites, verse 27, you shall say, you got to tell the kids, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, for he passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he slew the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed their heads and worshipped. All right, so the death of the firstborn happens, and Pharaoh's firstborn son is slain. Okay, so now Pharaoh, who is seen as a deity in Egypt, now he is being afflicted directly by the plagues. His son, who's the future deity, is now killed as one of the gods of Egypt to receive judgment. Verse 33. And the Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we are all dead men. So the people took their dough before it was leavened. All right, underline that. That's why you get the emphasis of unleavened bread constantly in the Old Testament. It has to do with this first Passover. Also, make a note that this is happening in the middle of the night. All right, the angel death comes in the middle of the night. Everyone's freaking out because those who did not follow the directions of Moses, their firstborn's now dead, and immediately they go to the Israelites to kick them out. And same thing with the new Passover with Christ. The resurrection, all right, the transition from death to life happens at nighttime. Okay, it happens at that unknown hour before the morning. Yes, Ashton.
Is this when the whole plague of darkness is still going on too?
Good question. Does the plague of darkness get lifted? I honestly don't remember. I would just have to go back and reread it. So I'll follow up with that. Follow up with you after class about it. Okay. Because I think I've seen, I know I've seen movies where I think the plague of darkness is still going on, but as we talk about constantly, just because it's in a movie doesn't mean that's actually what's going on. All right, so hopping over to. Oh, okay, so we're at verse 33. All right, so Christ also rises early in the morning, and now it's early in the morning before the sunrise, and Israel's being pushed out the door. They have to take their dough before it's leavened. Their kneading bowls being bound up in their mantles on their shoulders. Verse 35. The sons of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked of the Egyptians jewelry of silver and of gold and clothing. And the Lord had given people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they let them have what they asked. Thus they despoiled the Egyptians. From this we get this phrase, take the Egyptian gold. So the Egyptian gold is supposed to be used to, one, God's giving his people, the nation, like some wealth to get started. But these materials are supposed to be used then to construct the tabernacle in the wilderness. Where are they going to make the beautiful, bronze rings and the gold ladders, what have you? It's going to be from the wealth that they despoiled from the Egyptians. So you take the Egyptian gold, so to speak. You take what's useful from the world and you consecrate it to God. It's one of those spiritual principles that gets applied. So an example that could be like Greece was a pagan society. Okay, they did horrible things in their cult worships of their gods. However, you can steal the Egyptian gold from the Greeks, so to speak, by reading Plato, because there's something good, and then you can take the philosophy and baptize it to a certain extent, and it actually does have some value. Okay, same principle in that line of thought of take the Egyptian gold. Verse 37. And the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. And a mixed multitude also went with them, and very many cattle, both flocks and herds. So this mixed multitude means that Gentiles are traveling with them. All right, so how many people are there? It's hard to estimate. Could it be anywhere between 5 to 10 million? All right, is what you're estimating here in terms of who is doing this mass exodus from the land of Egypt. But that mixed multitude is the Gentiles are being saved by their conversion to their recognizing Yahweh's power and might. So the plagues of Egypt ends up saving the Egyptians who are not hard of heart and are willing to listen and wise enough. Verse 39. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry, neither had they prepared for themselves any provisions. So it's a good thing they had that hearty lamb the night before. Verse 40, the time that the sons of Israel dwelt in Egypt was 430 years, and at the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by the Lord. Underline that phrase, that night of watching. Christ's night before his passion, before he's offered up as the sacrificial lamb, is also a night of watching in Gethsemane. So this is a foreshadowing of the agony in the garden in Gethsemane. To bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept the Lord by all the sons of Israel throughout their generations. Verse 43, we get some regulations regarding how the Passover is to be celebrated. At verse 48, we read, "And when a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There shall be one law for the native and the stranger who sojourns among you." So stranger Gentiles who are joining in the nation of Israel, if they want to participate in the Passover, if they want to come to that sacrificial feast of unleavened bread and the flesh of this sacrificial victim, they have to be circumcised in order to participate in that meal. All right, this is another parallel you get between circumcision and baptism. All right, there's a reason why if you're not baptized, you can't participate in the Eucharist at Mass. Right? It's the same motive, same sacrifice deal going on here. If you're going to join the old Passover, you have to be circumcised. If you're going to join the new Passover, you have to be baptized. Baptism is how you become a member of the church in the new law, the New Testament. Circumcision is how you became a member of the covenantal family in the Old Law and New Testament. Yes, Lily? Yeah. All right, jump down to chapter 13. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the sons of Israel, both of man and of beast, is mine." So under this passage, just make a note that this is the original plan. This ends up not happening because of the sin of the golden calf. But God's original plan for the Israelites was that the firstborn son of every family would have a priestly role. What do priests do? What's the job of a priest in any religion? Asheron? To offer sacrifice, okay? So the firstborn of every family would have this priestly duty and responsibility. However, we're going to see that this plan has to get next. Verse 3, "And Moses said to the people, 'Remember this day in which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of bondage. For by strength of hand the Lord brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. This day you are to go forth in the month of Abib. And when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this service in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen with you, and no leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory. And you shall tell your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. And it shall be to you as a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this ordinance at its appointed time from year to year." All right, what does that mean? When he says in verse 9, "And it shall be to you as a sign on your hand and a memorial between your eyes." All right, so sign on your hand. In everything you do, your actions, the hand is the prominent sign of your activity and your actions. In all your actions, remember what God has done for you on this Passover. Between your eyes, referring to what's in your noggin, okay? On your mind. Always call to mind what the Lord did for you in Passover, both in thought and in deed. That's what the direction means. Verse 11. "And when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and shall give it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. All the firstlings of your cattle that are males shall be the Lord's. Every firstling of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. And when in time to come your son asks you, 'What does this mean?' you shall say to him, 'By strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of bondage. For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord slew all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of cattle. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that first open the womb. But all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be as a mark on your hand or frontlets between your eyes. For by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt." All right, so again, the whole purpose, it's catechesis. All right. Families don't have bookshelves at homes to read these things to kids. So you pass on through your traditions and through your ceremonies. Jumping down to verse 21. So they're leaving Egypt, and they're getting some guidance from God. Verse 21, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud, highlight, to lead them on the way, and by night in a highlight pillar of fire, to give them light that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. So that imagery of God's presence being with them as a cloud and as fire, it's going to be used constantly throughout the rest of Scripture, okay? Especially the cloud. The cloud's going to be very important. Chapter 14, we get to the crossing of the Red Sea, and just make a note that there's, you could say, almost say it's drowning in baptismal imagery. Just this whole chapter is dripping in baptismal imagery. So we'll go through this entire chapter and highlight some of those. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the sons of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pihahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-Zephon, and you shall encamp over against it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say to the sons of Israel, they are entangled in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, and the Egyptians shall know that I'm the Lord. And they did so. So God is now going to get glory over Pharaoh. God has been getting glory over all the Egyptian gods with each plague. And now the last god to be conquered in the Egyptian pantheon is Pharaoh himself. Verse 5, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people. And they said, what is this we have done? They have let Israel go from, what's the whole theme of the Exodus? Serving us. All right, so they got behind the land of slavery and servitude to the Egyptians so they can go serve Yahweh. And now Pharaoh's having second thoughts. So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 picked chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the sons of Israel as they went forth defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them and camped at the sea by Pihahiroth and in front of Baal-Zephon. When Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they were in great fear. And the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us and bring us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us, underline, serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. All right. Bear in mind, they just witnessed all the plagues. You would think after plague number 10, you'd have enough faith that God's in control. But this is the problem of the Israelites. They'll believe in the signs, but they're not going to believe the words of Moses. And their faith is super shaky. So now they're just telling Moses, like, look, it's hopeless. I would have rather stayed in servitude. And now you kind of start to see why the name Israel is so fitting. It's he who wrestles with God. All right, this is a rebellious, stiff-necked nation, which we're going to be constantly referred to. And now they're even ready to just throw in the towel and go back as these slaves in Egypt. Let's jump ahead to verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land. So we get the use of this word ruah, R-U-A-H, wind. It means wind or spirit. And you can make a note back to Genesis 1. You can make a note back to the Noah's flood. All right, in the beginning, the world was without form and void, and the Spirit of God was over the waters. After the flood, God sends a wind, the Spirit, to dry the land, and a new creation emerges. In the crossing of the Red Sea and leaving behind the land of slaves and leaving behind all the demonic worshipers and those who would enslave you, God sends his breath, his wind, his Spirit over the water. And you get this reference in baptismal ceremonies when the priest, he blows over the baptismal font water, right? And it's calling to mind, it's symbolizing that breath of God being over the waters, which is about to initiate a new creation. And Israel is about to pass through these waters that are lethal, all right? Because water can be life-giving, but it can also be lethal. So they pass through this death, and they emerge as a new nation. Verse 22, and the sons of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watched the Lord in the pillar of fire and the cloud looked down upon the host of the Egyptians and discomfited the host of the Egyptians, clogging their chariots' wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. And then the Egyptians, all right, so Israel makes it past the sea. They pass through the waters. The sea returns, and it washes out and destroys Pharaoh's army. So just as the waters of baptism, once you pass them, all your sins are washed away. Your slavery to Satan, right, and all the demons that would be pursuing you in that instance as a slave to Satan, washed away, taken care of, enter the wilderness. And what do you have to do after you're baptized? Well, you got to grow up and you got to get some catechesis. You got to learn about God. So maybe you should be taught the 10 Commandments. And then eventually you have this manna as food for the journey that keeps you going through this life until you reach the promised land after 40 years. So everything here is an allegory for the entire Christian life of going from baptism to catechesis to having food sustain you on the journey and then making eventually to your end destination. Jump ahead to verse 30. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. And Israel saw the great work which the Lord did against the Egyptians, and the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Again, just pointing out another similarity to the Gospel of John. Israel sees the works, and they believe the Lord and his servant Moses. But they're not at the point where they're believing Moses' word or having faith to know that God's going to always take care of them. But they're seeing his work, and then they're having this kind of after-the-fact confidence. Chapter 15. Then Moses and the sons of Israel sang this song to the Lord, saying, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. You can make a note here. This is it's in Psalm 118. And this will become relevant when we get to the book of Psalms and we talk about authorship of the book of Psalms and where the Psalms come from. But just pay attention and note that here very early on, we get some, Psalm just means song, right? So this is a song that the Israelites are singing in glory of God. It does get passed on later, eventually becoming a psalm, as we know them. Jump ahead to verse 10, chapter 15, verse 10. You blew with your wind or spirit on the sea and covered them. They sank as lead in the mighty waters. Right? Again, you get that use of ruah, and that points to that imagery of God's breath, which he also breathes into Adam's nostrils, right, in creation. And so it's like God pours his spirit into man in his creation. Jump ahead to verse 14. The peoples have heard, they tremble. Remember, God said this, the whole point is to reveal himself to the nations as well. So the people have heard, they tremble. Pangs have seized on the inhabitants of Philistia. Again, we're also getting a synonymous parallelism. You say the same thing back-to-back times. This is just good Hebrew poetry. Now are the chiefs of Edom dismayed. The leaders of Moab trembling seizes them. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. So they're making reference to the people who live on what's the modern day Gaza Strip, right, which is on the other side of the Red Sea. So the land that they're about to enter into and the new enemies they're going to have to encounter, they're already hearing about how God has been fighting on their behalf. Verse 20, then Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and dancing. And Miriam sang to them, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. So here's one of the few examples in the Old Testament of a prophetess. It's Moses' sister. And what is her prophecy? It's a past tense prophecy. Again, just emphasizing the person who is the mouthpiece of God is what a prophet is. It's not the foreteller. You can even be a prophet about past events, which is an example of what Miriam's doing here. Verse 22, then Moses led Israel onward from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore, it was named Marah, which means bitter. And the people murmured against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? Okay, so much for believing, the works that they saw. It's not like they have evidence to think that God might have some control over water. But they're going to murmur against Moses. Verse 25, and he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and he threw it in the water, and the water became sweet. So again, you get some baptismal imagery and foreshadowing of the cross. All right, why is the death of baptism sweet? Good. It's because by the death of baptism, you're dying with Christ in his crucifixion, and then you're also rising with him to new life. So by the cross, death is made sweet. By the cross, by this wood, the bitter waters are made sweet. Chapter 16, we get to the introduction of manna. They set out from Elim and all. Well, you can also make a note. So your title probably has headings of like manna from heaven. Just make a note that there's flesh here too. It's bread and it's flesh. Chapter 16. They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin. Ooh, they're in the wilderness of Sin. Okay. Sin's not a Hebrew word. It's an English word. Okay. So translated, it means the wilderness of clay. So they're surrounded by a bunch of, they're like infields of clay. It's the wilderness of clay. And in English, it sounds like they're entering the wilderness of sin, but that would not be in the original audience or the original author's mind as they're going through this. Okay. Could have some relevance to us. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, but as we're trying to look at the text through who's the author, what's his message, what's the intended audience, that's not necessarily part of the narrative. Yeah.
But also, like, sin, clay drags you down. So, like, you get stuck in clay, and then it's harder to get where you're going.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, Israel will get bogged down by their sin, so to speak. Jumping ahead to verse 3. Moses, or the people say to Moses and Aaron, would that we have died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. All right, so that's your typical diet back in the day. You have a little flesh pot, and you got some bread. What are you eating for lunch? Bread. What are you eating for dinner? Bread. Maybe a little flesh. What's for breakfast? Bread. What's for lunch? Bread. What's for dinner? That little bit of flesh pot and some bread. Okay, so this is like your typical diet. So would that we had died in the land of Egypt with our like McDonald's drive-through is essentially what they're telling Moses. Okay, it's like, really? After everything you've seen, this is where we're getting. Okay, again, just that name Israel. They're wrestling with God, kicking and screaming the whole way. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven. So you can also make a note here to John chapter 6. John chapter 6 is the bread of life discourse. And that whole bread of life discourse parallels very closely the Exodus account of the manna and the flesh pots and the grumbling of the Israelites and the grumbling of Christ's disciples. So John chapter 6. All right, so God promises them bread from heaven. And in verse 8, and also flesh. So verse 8, and Moses said, when the Lord gives you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your murmurings, which you murmur against him, what are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against Yahweh. So God's going to send them flesh and bread. The flesh is going to be quails, and then the bread's going to be the manna. Verse 12, just keep highlighting the flesh and bread motif here. I've heard the murmurings of the sons of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat flesh, in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp. In the morning dew lay around about the camp. So a quail, it's a small bird. You can eat it. It's got some meat. It's got enough meat for like one person. So God's sending a bunch of quails to the Israelites through this wind that he blows onto the camp. They all show up in mass. And so the Israelites can go up, pick up their quail, slaughter it, and each person can get the amount of meat that they need. And when the dew, verse 14, and when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as hoarfrost on the ground. When the sons of Israel saw it, they said to one another, manhu, which is the Hebrew word that means, what is it? Manhu, M-A-N-H-U is Hebrew. Manhu, what is it? And so this stuff that they keep finding every morning now is called, except on the Sabbath, is called manhu. And by the time the Hebrew language falls out of use, by the time of Christ, the language that's spoken is Aramaic, not Hebrew. The Aramaic version of this word is manna. M-A-N-N-A. So when we call this stuff manna, we're using the Aramaic word. The original Hebrew would be manna. And we'll pick up here.